In this corner, you see my various power tools. I have a 14-inch bandsaw that I use to cut out copper. I use a standard wooden blade, at least 14 tooths per inch, and at regular speeds for doing woodwork. This saw also has the capability of going to very low speeds to cut steel and iron. The other tool that I use a lot of is my drill press, with a variety of stands that I make out of wood or steel to take and hold projects of various types so that they can be drilled accurately. You'll see in the corner where it says Bosch, that is actually a router table, and for some of my work I use a router to route out the shapes, and there are a variety of stands and supports sitting around this area that I use to support the copper work as I am creating different pieces. The next area of my shop is where I have some of my cutting tools and my box and pan or finger brake. You'll notice sitting above them there's a supply of copper pipe off to the top right and a supply of copper wire. I use a whole variety of sizes of copper wire and copper pipe in what I do in terms of making fountains and hinges and all sorts of things out of copper. My go-to shear for cutting metal is this gray 24-inch Diacro lever shears. This shears will cut up to 14 gauge copper. It cuts very straight, very accurately, and it's fairly easy to cut on here with a precision down to a 32nd of an inch or better. As I say, this is one of my go-to tools for cutting. If I swing over just a little bit, there is my smaller Diacro shears. The brown one there is actually a 1-foot shears or 12-inch shears, which I use for a lot of my smaller work. Another shears that I use regularly is this angle shears or 90-degree shears. It is used to cut notching in corners and is often called a notcher. Right now I have it set up to cut a 2-inch notch out of a piece of metal for making boxes. It's a very accurate way to set up and do a repetitive cut into the corner of metal. In the foreground you'll see another one of my shears. This is actually a circle cutter or circle shears by Pexto. What it will allow you to do is cut perfect circles out of sheet metal. In this case it will allow me to cut copper up to about 0.032 thickness, which is sufficient for the bottoms of many of the things I make and actually for projects in their entirety. The nice thing about this is you set it, you lock it in place, you put your piece of square copper in, crank the lever that's off, you can see off to the right, and when you crank that lever, it spins the copper and cuts the circle for you. For doing the bottoms of vases, we cut circles out of this and then later use a lathe to spin those circles into cups that fit into the bottom of vases. Immediately behind this you see a small number 2 shear, Beverly shear, that is also used. It's called an open throat shear because you can feed metal through it and get all sorts of not just straight but angled cuts, and it will again cut very heavy metal, easily cutting 14 or 16 gauge copper and sometimes thicker. My last go-to shear is this 36-inch Pexto and Wilcox treadle shears. This shears is set up for cutting larger metal sheets, and since most of the metal I get in is in a 2-foot by 3-foot sheet, this gives me the flexibility of cutting it in any size or shape that I wish. If you notice, there is on the left-hand side a front gauge that I can set accurately to manage the size of the pieces that I cut, not seen here, I also have a rear gauge that I can put on if I need to do repetitive work that I feed through the shear and stop and cut. This shear is extremely useful in handling all my larger pieces of metal. As you can see from all of these shears, cutting is one of the prime things that we do in copper work, and cutting accurately really helps determine whether a piece is a nice piece or a sloppy piece. The tool that you see here is a diacro finger brake. If you notice, looks like it's missing pieces, and that's because the fingers are removable and adjustable. The finger brake is used for bending metal, and by being able to only use certain fingers, it allows you to fold the side of boxes in and create three-dimensional pieces by bending. This tool, again, is a go-to tool and a must-have in most copper shops. I am fortunate to have a wet area in my coppersmith shop. I actually bought this garage from my father-in-law and reworked it into a shop, and when I did it, I had plumbing put in. You do a lot of washing and cleaning in coppersmithing, where you take metal and scrub it with soap and water and fine steel wool or Scotch-Brite pads in between solderings and workings, and finally before you patina pieces. You might notice that over in the corner there is a small container of blue liquid. That is Supertannic 44, which we use to patina the copper. I will show how that's used later in another video. I do a lot of grinding and forming here in the coppersmith shop, and I use several tools to do that. The first of which is the Jet 2x42-inch belt sander that you see in the left of this image. That belt sander allows me to grind copper into pattern shapes, so they're very accurate. In the middle of the bench, there is a standard grinder that has a medium wheel on the left-hand side, and the wheel that you see with the blue stripe on the right-hand side is a diamond wheel, which is very nice for working on tools because it does not develop ingrained grooves or anything like that, and is a fine tool for removing metal. On the next side of that, you'll see a buffer, and that does have a buffing wheel on it on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side there is a 7S deburring wheel, 3M 7F deburring wheel, which is probably a go-to wheel in the shop for cleaning up pieces, smoothing edges, polishing tools. You use it all the time, and having one really makes work a lot easier. You might also notice that there's some duct work above my tools. All my grinding tools are connected to a dust collection system. I get real nervous about silicone dust and other dusts that are generated when we grind and process copper, so I put in a dust collection system that sucks all that dust out of the shop and puts it into a bag in the back room. I wanted to show you a little bit closer view of my work area. My workbench, as you can see, or work plate, is a fairly large piece of plate steel that's about 1/2 inch thick. The blue channels you see to the side of it actually hold Kreg hold downs that I can use to clamp down my metal when I'm working. You'll see this later on. Immediately behind my work area is my rack of chasing tools and repoussé tools. You can see there's quite a variety of tools here. There's my chasing hammers, some measuring tools, scrapers, riveting tools, and a wide variety of both chasing and repoussé tools. Next to that is my rack of hammers, and I use quite a few hammers. This is just a small portion of my collection, and then above that are all my files that I use. And again, I use quite a few files of different coarsenesses. My go-to files have a tendency to either be half round or flat files with a fine cut. My bench also has places where I hang a variety of measuring tools, and other tools that I use get set on the bench. So that is a kind of a full go around of the shop. Hopefully you find it somewhat interesting. And as I say, if you see anything in the shop, just reference it in an email to john@luminesque.com, and I will try to speak to it either in a video or in an email directly back to you. Thank you.